Heidi Pellerano, welcome to the Sports Management Podcast.
Thank you, Marcus. It's great to be here.
It's my pleasure to have you on the show. You are the Chief Commercial Officer at the CONCACAF. So can you tell us a little bit about, first of all, what is CONCACAF and then your responsibilities as the CCO?
Great. Thank you, Marcus. First of all, I got to give you credit because most people struggle to say CONCACAF. It just doesn't roll out of your tongue. So I appreciate you working very hard to say it correctly. So for those listening that might not be familiar, CONCACAF is one of the 6 FIFA confederations. If you look, FIFA was able to structure the global game in a way that you have a European Union, which is UEFA. You have obviously a South American, which is CONMEBOL, Asia, Africa, Oceania, and us. Our confederation covers what would be North America, Central America, and Caribbean. That is a total of 41 members, associations. And so we cover everything in the north in Canada, all the way to the south in Suriname, Guyana. And our job as a confederation is to really help develop the sport at all levels, right? Not men's, women's, all disciplines, 11v11, futsal, beach. So it's a great privilege and an honor. And as a chief commercial officer, my particular role is really focused on generating the revenue to sustain the strategy of growth for the sport.
That's very interesting. And obviously now there is a very interesting time for football in the United States, specifically with the World Cup coming. So how do you feel, now with how's the interest for football and for your side bringing in revenues? Is it easier now when it's, top of mind for many people?
It's interesting because we kind of didn't know when the conversation was going to pick up, right? And I think a little bit of that was fostered by the fact that the 2022 World Cup in Qatar was in December. So there was a little bit of a kind of a quiet period after that where people were just, I think, kind of catching their bearings because that threw everybody off, right? A December World Cup, which was obviously very well done and did a great deal for the sport. And it was quite a global spectacle. But now, as you started thinking, I think people started waking up little by little and saying, oh, hold on, now the next World Cup is bigger, has in terms of participating teams, more countries, and cities in which it's going to be played. And it's 3.5 years. So all of a sudden, 23, I think a lot of people were still a little bit in a fog. And now 24, people have now started a lot of the conversation. And I think that also helped when FIFA, towards the end of 23, announced the brand. This year, at the beginning of the year, did a little bit of the calendar. So that really brought this to the forefront of people's discussions. And it's fascinating when I turn on my TV, obviously the friendlies are going on and some of the networks have the Euros, others have Copa America, but there's also a lot of promotion for the World Cup. And the narrative is that, right? It's coming to our region, is coming to the 3 amazing countries that have a lot. And I think it's really exciting. So in terms of the question about whether it's make it harder or not, or easier, it's kind of maybe somewhere in the middle, to be quite honest, because there was a period of time where everybody was saying, okay, I need to, if I have a football strategy, is it good enough? How do I expand on that? There was the other people that said, oh, if I don't have a football strategy, what does that look like? And there's actually a lot of people in that. And then now people started saying, okay, well, I hear there's a new model, right? Because there's these host committees, and in the host committees, they're selling packages. So it actually kind of stalled a little bit, the market, because people were waiting on that information on how the new FIFA structure was going to work. And then now that has started to be more readily available and conversations are happening, then people are saying, okay, now I see kind of all the pieces of the puzzle or all the available options for me to build my football strategy. And then, and I think the good thing is that obviously there's opportunity for everybody, right? I don't like to think about it as, oh, I'm competing with FIFA or I'm competing with the host committee, because we all offer something different. right? And I think that's what you then, it might require a little bit more work because some of the people you might normally be talking to are receiving a lot of information and proposals and might be overwhelmed trying to sort it out. So what we've done is we spend more time ourselves being more selective about who we approach, because we believe, everybody's probably talking to the same people. So it's important for us to be a little bit more strategic on who we approach. And I think hopefully this will yield, opportunities for everybody, right? The federations themselves, the host committees, FIFA, us. And then now the biggest thing for us, to be quite honest, is that we're trying to build something that doesn't have, a precipice in 26 where everybody builds towards 26. We're trying to build things that we can hopefully leverage the momentum, leverage the conversation and the attention, but to create longer term success.
Yeah, I think that's key. But also, of course, there will be an elevation during the 2026 World Cup. But as you said, not only to build for that, but also how to sustain that afterwards. And I like what you said with the, that you're a little bit picky with your partners, because I feel like it's more the commercial business nowadays is more a partnership than a sponsorship. It's not like I give you X money and I do this. It's more how can you have a mutual beneficial relationship.
Correct. Yeah, and I think that's very critical. There's people that you can have a conversation and potentially get a decent size rights fee, but then they're just worried about their LED field boards. They're worried about their tickets. But then that's great because you did get the rights fee, which obviously most of all of our organizations are not for profit, so that is invested in the sport, which is great. But you don't necessarily in that situation get the type of collaboration that helps you elevate, right? That is too transactional. And I think because we are still very much in our growth trajectory, we're not a mature confederation in the sense, commercially speaking. I don't even think yet football speaking, we're there. And because we're in a growth trajectory, we want partners that understand that and are committed to elevate that, so that they can commit and say, hey, I'm going to do this type of activations, whether it's at retail, or I'm going to do this activations on broadcast, or I'm going to do this, take your property and do activations offsite the stadiums. That is an ideal scenario for us because, obviously I'm an engineer, so it's very tough for me to say this, but those are the things where 1 + 1 = 3. Right? Because now they're bringing something else to the table that really is beneficial to then help you kind of in this, the objectives that you want in terms of growing the entire ecosystem.
Yeah. So you mentioned you have a longer plan than 26, but if we go back to 1994, when was the World Cup, now 30 years ago, I mean, that made a huge impact on football in US, and now we are 30 years later. You still say that you are early in your progress, maybe, eh? So how
Yeah,
has
absolutely.
I know you haven't been with CONCACAF for all these years, but if you have seen the trends from the in 1994 and where we are now, and then also what the future looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's great as you scare when you say 30, really hits you, right? So I think there's a couple of things to consider, right? In terms of that, how to answer that. Obviously, on the back of 94 was the start of the MLS, right? So, and with that, you see where the MLS is today. And I say that there's growth in the sense that if you look at this country right now, the United States, where I'm based, the growth of the MLS in terms of the soccer, football specific stadiums, right? We have stadiums in this country for this sport that probably are not easily replicated around the world. Right. So that's the first thing that was achieved. Right now, it's an investment in infrastructure. There was then investment in terms of actually creating the league. And then the league has continued to grow. It's one of the most stable leagues. It's one of the leagues that is routinely in the top 8 around the world for attendance. So that is something that you have to take into consideration. Now with the arrival of Leo Messi, it's part of a global conversation, which I think is where I kind of go back and say we're still maturing because we are very much grown significantly, but we haven't really yet transcended to that global like platform that everybody around the world, that if you're in Sweden or if you are in Germany or if you're in China, that you are talking about the MLS or the US national team or the Mexico national team, that there's this incredible the fight for our talent. And I think we are now in that generation. These young players, you know, I use this a little bit of this kind of concept to bring this to the table. But I started my career in sports working at the Women's National Basketball Association, the WNBA. When you talk to the players back then, right, Elisa Leslie, Atina Thompson, they played the sport because they loved it. And then their aspiration was to get a scholarship, to get a college education, but their aspiration was to play in the Olympics, right? That was the pinnacle for them. And they did not see the sport as a means to have a career unless they became coaches, because most of these women didn't want to go to Europe or Asia to play the sport, right? Now you talk to this new generation of players, they grew up since they were 4, 5, 6 years old saying, I want to play in the WNBA, right? So what happens now, the level of commitment, right? The time you're dedicating to your craft, it's different. Now you have players that you look at the debate that's happening in this country, where one of the more, Caitlin Clark was left out of the Olympic team, but everybody's saying, who would you have kept off the Olympic team? Like, they're that talented, right? So that's what I think is going to happen to the sport in our region, especially in the United States and in some other countries, where now the kids today, the Christian Pulisic and others, grew up with an MLS saying, oh, I can play this sport and stay in this country, right? Or I can go to Europe, but I have the choice, and maybe I can do both. That's going to change the level of skill, right, that you will see. And that's why, you know, when you look at our teams in our CONCACAF region, they're young, they're very talented. We have a lot of young players that are still are still in the place of in the works to make a name for themselves, but they are playing in European leagues as well. So I think now we're going to benefit of all that investment that happened after '94. This is unfortunately when you start playing it, because it's kind of you have to go through a couple of generations for it to be something that now is natural.
Yeah, definitely. So now we'll talk a lot about the men's World Cup now in 26, but women's football is on the rise all globally, but also, of course, in North America as well. So do you think that although it's a men's World Cup, that this will help elevate also the women's football?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think, you know, to your point, the women's football is living a moment that all of us that love it hope it never ends, right? And that it continues to just to build from this incredible momentum. You know, I was just in Mexico last week for a conference, and I got the opportunity to speak on this subject, and sat in through some of the presentations and was able to see some of the statistics from the Barcelona Femenil, from some of the statistics on the Liga MX, the Mexican League Femenil, and it's incredible what is happening with the sport. You saw it with the Lionesses in the Euros. You saw it in Australia and New Zealand in 23. For us at CONCACAF, right, it's been a strong priority and commitment from our president, Victor Montagliani. You know, he used to be president of Canada Soccer. He was a key person in bringing the World Cup to Canada in 2015. He believes in it, but also follows through and has developed a plan for CONCACAF to grow, because a lot of times people would look at CONCACAF and say, you guys don't need to invest in women's football, because they only saw the tip of the iceberg, the US and Canadian national teams, right? And we're saying, hold on, we have 39 on their members. We have some countries where still there is some stigma associated with young girls playing the sport. We don't have professional leagues in all of our 41 countries. So that's where our focus has been, right? And to making sure that, you know, even our campaign speaks to that, which is we belong. And because we wanted to find something that resonated with everybody, regardless of where they were. So United States, you belong at the top, and you belong lifting that trophy. Canada, you know, you belong to get there because you're this close. But Jamaica, you belong in playing in a World Cup. And then other teams like where I'm from, Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, Haiti, you actually belong playing, and you can aspire to win continental championships and then aspire then to get to the global stage. So that has really been the commitment. So now with this sport, you know, what you will see is, I will tell you, anybody that I've ever met that is in their 30s to 40s in this country, when you talk about when they fell in love with the sport, if they're not from an immigrant that came from that culture, right? If they're not Brazilian immigrants or Mexican immigrants, they all talk about 94. So that is what the sport allows us to do, right? Because it's not just going to be, it's going to be whole families coming to see the World Cup, and little girls are going to go to mom and dad and say, can I do that? Absolutely. Let's go home and watch the NWSL, right? You know, and that's what you want, right? This allows us to pick the interest for those that maybe haven't gotten the bug yet. And then for those who have got the bug, maybe gives us the amplification that maybe now the parents get more excited and want to support their kids in this endeavor. So I do believe that the World Cup itself will be huge for the sport in general, men, women, boys, girls. And then obviously US and Mexico are putting hopefully a very strong bid to try to see if they can get the 31 World Cup as well for women.
That would be amazing. And you mentioned a good point there that, of course, the US and the Canadian women national teams are really, really strong. But you mentioned there are 39 other members, and you mentioned in the beginning with everything to, you know, Suriname and Guyana. So how is it like because the CONCACAF, you need to, of course, serve all of these 41 member associations. So you have some very, very strong ones and maybe some that are new and a little bit, you know, up and coming. So how do you balance this out in your work?
Yeah, I mean, this is a strong commitment from everybody across the board. And I think one of the biggest things that I think our president, our general secretary saw as critical was unity, right? We had to create a unified confederation. So it didn't look like it was like the North Americans with one agenda, the Central Americans with a different agenda, and the Caribbeans with a different agenda, or even the Caribbeans splitting between the English speaking, the Spanish speaking, the French speaking, the Dutch speaking, right? So we have really created, it's even our logo is the unity symbol. But then from there, to do that, that's a beautiful concept, but how does it work in practice? By listening, right? We don't sit here in our headquarters in Miami and come up with these plans and say, oh my God, this is brilliant, everybody's going to love it. We actually sit and talk to each of our stakeholders on a regular basis to understand where they are, what are the challenges that they're dealing with, and then we come back and adjust. And I'll give you some tangible examples, both on the men's and women's side. When our leadership, took over the Confederation in 2015, 2016, post-FIFA scandal, one of the things they realized is we have 41 members, but only about maybe 10 members get to compete on a regular basis, right? The competitions were structured in a way that just really benefited the bigger. So the first thing our leadership did was expand the Gold Cup, and then expand qualification into the Gold Cup by creating Nations League. Nations League allows all 41 members to participate. So we had our first edition of that. And then we've seen tremendous success because now, and you see it very tangible in a competitive basis where you see it because it has promotion relegation. So you see that, but you also see the disparity in scores is shrinking. And furthermore, now you're seeing more teams qualifying to Gold Cup than you had ever before. Right? So but then what happened? So great, we did it, we achieved it, but we had a lot of feedback from the members to say, hey, it's not that easy to travel across these islands. So we said, okay, so it's not scrapping Nations League and say, well, that experiment didn't work. No, we took that feedback and said, okay, what if we create hubs, right? And we minimize the travel for League B and League C, where they see this train the most. So we went back to the members and say, we had a great first edition, second edition, but we heard your feedback, the challenges. we propose the following adjustments. We go to the council first, then we go to the presidents to say, we believe this is the best way for us to address your concerns. So now we make those changes going into this now 4th edition. So that's kind of where I think you see that at play. So every time we come in, on the men's side, when we were going to do Champions Cup, we met with MLS, we met with Liga MX, we met with the Panamanian League, the Costa Rican League, we met with the Central American Union, we met with the Caribbean Union, we met with the Jamaican League, and we listen. And that's what allows us to say, wow, at the end of the day, they all want the chance to go to the Club World Cup, but they also want to really have this moment of time to say, I'm the best club in Central America, I'm the best club in the Caribbean. They want to feel that rivalry. So the format reflected that, because now we created regional cups that all feed into the Champions Cup that then feeds into the Club World Cup. So that's kind of how we've achieved it. So, and on the women's side, it's no different. For a long time, people wanted us, and we wanted to launch our women's club competition. But the first thing we needed to do was, well, we need to audit the leagues across, because we never want to launch it, and then all of a sudden the scores are 13-0, 20-0. So we actually did an audit of each of our professional leagues, and we kind of ranked them and then created a format that really adapted to that. But what we hope now is we created a system that encourages further investment so that we can expand the format in the future.
I like that, because the uncertainty of outcome is so important, right? As you said, otherwise the sport will lose its value a little bit if all the games are 15, 20-0. So it's good to have these regional games as well, for them also to get some rivalry, but also have some closer games, and then you can have the bigger competition later.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's good. Yeah, we had talked about, men, women, but also, to include everyone. And I read that you are recognized this year as a champion of diversity. So I guess a two-part question, but first of all, why is this important to you? And second of all, how are you working with diversity in your day-to-day?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, I come from a system where or a structure, I had the opportunity or the blessing to work in organizations that really recognize the power of diversity for what it brings to the table, versus say, hey, let's do it so that we don't get into trouble legally or anything like that. And I'm a big proponent that, individuals are a collection of experiences, and those collection of experiences can be fueled by their gender, where they were born, where they went to school, what were their circumstances, growing up at home. And that is all valuable, because that shapes the perspective that you can bring to the table. And I think that's what makes it important to have a diverse thought, right? It's like, instead of thinking about it as diverse people, I try to look at it as diverse thought and diverse experiences, because, it's very, let's say, in some of the more sensitive topics, right, that we can get into and say, hey, the statistics show that girls are dropping out at this higher rate of participation. And people go, I don't understand, right? Well, I can come in and say, as a woman, let me tell you about all of the different experiences that potentially influenced me from dropping out, but I didn't drop out, but I felt the pressure to drop out, right? And that humanizes it a little bit and allows people to go, oh, I would have never thought of that. Let me address it differently, right? And I think that's what we want, right? I can tell you, I'm from the Caribbean, but my experiences growing up in Puerto Rico are probably very different from somebody else that grew up in Grenada or Guyana or Anguilla. So having people from those diverse backgrounds is extremely important, because now I'm going to sit at a table, listen to them, and be able to think about a better solution, right? Or an alternative that maybe to that word is more inclusive and representative of who we are as a confederation. So that to me is the most important thing, is not to look at it as a gender or color of skin situation, but say those are all elements that influence that person's experience. And therefore, that's what we're looking for, people with different experiences and thoughts process. right? So that's why I'm a big champion of that, because I think it makes us better as an organization. I can tell you till this day, even I learn a lot from the young people on my team, because they bring a completely different perspective to the table than sometimes I do, right? So that it all comes in, right? Like I see them, the role social media plays in their lives, and I'm like, wow, that is so very different to me. So again, that's extremely valuable. Age experiences, or and so that, and I really encourage people to think about that, because I do believe that by looking at like very binary gender, male, female, color of skin, right, age, you're missing kind of the bigger picture of why diversity matters. And and the other part that I will say is that it's important to me too to promote diversity in the right way. I've never been a person about, like in the United States, I know this happens in other countries, there's a lot of kind of intervention from government to make sure that there's opportunities. So they put quotas, right?
Yeah.
And then sometimes that can have a negative connotation, because then, or a negative consequence, I should say, because now you might have people say, oh, let's put a woman on that role. Okay, that's great, but is that the right woman for the role? Right? Like, let's not just put any woman in the role or any person from a diverse background, but let's make sure we find the right person for the role. So that to me is kind of the balance of it, is about making sure that we change the perception of what diversity means. And number two, that in the process, we are developing the right diverse talent, so they have a chance to succeed and really contribute to the organization.
I couldn't agree with you more. And it's always difficult to sit as a white male, straight male in his 30s to have opinions about these type of things. But if I'm trying to think myself in a position of someone in a minority, if you get a position because of this that you mentioned, maybe you are from a certain, you have a certain age or a gender or something, I would think like, did I get this because I'm the best person for this job, or do I'm getting it because of other factors? And then you will never really know. So to have it, to get the role based on merit and on quality.
Exactly. And by the way, it's important to highlight that it's a puzzle, right? Like you need the white male straight in their 30s, because that's another valuable opinion that I can benefit from, right? And I think that's the other piece, because a lot of times by doing this, then it creates unneeded competition, right? And then by creating that unneeded competition, then now we might not be helping each other. So imagine if I'm able to share my experiences with you, and then you, Marcus, share your experiences with me, we're both better, right? And we both grow and can contribute even more to the organization.
100%. And I mean, it's proven that diverse teams are performing better. That's a fact nowadays. So on that point, your background is really interesting, because you mentioned before that you're an engineer. You don't have a
Yes.
football background. So can you talk a little bit about your, when you grew up and how you ended up in football and in sports?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's great, because hopefully for everybody that's listening, they can understand also what drives me a little bit. But as I mentioned, I grew up in Puerto Rico, and in our culture, right, very Latin culture, your parents sacrifice so that you can, get a good education, so that you can get a good job. But and I know it's changed a lot. This is many, many, many years ago. There was a myopic view of like paths, right? So therefore, since you were in school, I remember people saying, oh, you're good in science and math, why don't you pursue this, right? Engineering or medicine and stuff like that. And I remember always kind of, I don't know, maybe I was contrarian or something, but I always be saying, but I also have good grades in history and English. Like what? But it's no, but there's not enough women in science and math, so we want to encourage you. So you end up kind of a little bit following into that, and unfortunately not spending a lot of time thinking a little bit for yourself in terms of what you want to do. And I know it's changed tremendously, because I see it through my niece and my nephews, but that was my reality. And then I kind of say this because it's true. Like, I think I have my equivalent of my midlife crisis at 23, 24, where I started thinking about, okay, wait, how long did you have to work before you retire? Oh my goodness. So this is what my life is going to be for 35 years. Ooh, and that got me thinking a lot about, wow, is this what you want? Right. And I did like everybody else. I said, well, maybe it's the job I'm in right now. Let me go let me explore other engineering jobs. But to be honest with you, I always found something that just didn't click. It just didn't click. And that's what was really the first time where I took a step back and said, well, if you had to be honest with yourself and not worry about money or titles or all these other things that society influences you to think about, what makes you happy? And to me, I mean, I try to avoid it, to be quite honest, because it was scary, but it always came back to sports. I love sports. Since I was a baby, anything I could see, I wanted to do, I wanted to try. I watched it all. There was something about the triumph of human beings against the odds, the nature of trying to work, to outsmart your opponent or outstrength your opponent. Like, I was always fascinated about that. So I made the decision that I wanted to work in sports. I had no idea what that meant, though. So that was the next journey, because a lot of times then, people was like, oh, then become a coach. And I was coaching youth basketball at the time. So it was very natural for people around me to say coach. But I was like, no, I don't think that's what I was put on this earth to do, right? Like, I'm good coaching youth and having fun with it, but to make that my full-time job didn't make sense to me. So I started meeting my network, especially, I have to give a lot of credit, the parents of the little girls that I coach basketball. They were really critical in making introductions for me to other people that worked in sports, so I could really start figuring out what it meant to work in sports, to see what potential path I could take. I will tell you, and I gladly say that I'm happy that it's changed a lot since when I went through this 25 years plus ago. The sport wasn't, the world of sports wasn't very welcoming with somebody with my background. So I had to really try to figure out, how do I open that first door? Because nobody would open it for me. So I went to school. I went back to school to prove to everybody that I was committed to this. And my thought process is, now the university has an invested interest that I can't be an alum that's that way, right? Like, that don't have, like, you have to show the progress of your alums. They will help me connect with other alums that work in sports. So that was my thought process. And that's really how I got started in working in sports. Specific to football, I want to speak to that because it really does get to the heart of what motivates me every day as well. Is growing up in Puerto Rico, I didn't have access to the sport. It wasn't something that you saw. I was fortunate enough that my mom was a college professor at the time. She's retired now. And she used to have a program, her university in Puerto Rico had a program with a university in Spain. So one summer that my mom went to teach classes in Spain, she brought me with her. And I was fortunate enough, that was a World Cup year. There was the World Cup in '86 in Mexico. And I saw this country paralyzed by this thing I've never seen before. Never. Like, I'm like, what is this? I don't understand. What is this jersey? What is this ball people are kicking around in the streets? And the emotion of people rejoicing when Spain did well, crying their hearts out when Spain didn't well, that I was completely sucked into that. And obviously the people from Spain were very kind to be like, okay, poor girl, you've been living under a rock that you've never been introduced to this sport, so let's teach you. And that's kind of how my love for the sport began. And then obviously followed it mainly through national teams, right? The big national competitions. So tune in for the Euros and the Copa America leading up to the World Cup. And that's how it really started. So when this opportunity came up, it really spoke to me, because the mission and the vision that our president laid out was to help the little islands grow in the sport. So that was something that resonated for me, that, hopefully there's no other little girl growing up that's, has to discover the sport through another country. So that was really important to me when I came to CONCACAF.
I understand that. So in Puerto Rico, what sport, if football wasn't played much there, what sports did you grow up seeing and maybe playing?
Yeah, in terms of the most visible was baseball, right? But it wasn't, again, that accessible to girls either. So I played because my mom was very open-minded and let me, as long as my brother was nearby, I could do almost anything, right? But baseball, obviously, Puerto Rico has a strong history of baseball legends in playing in Major League Baseball here in the United States. My hero, even though I wasn't alive to ever see him play, but growing up there, you were completely brought into his legend, was Roberto Clemente. I usually actually wear his number when I play basketball. So I'm very tall. You can't see because I'm sitting down, but for a Latin woman, I'm really tall. I'm about 6 feet tall. So I played basketball, volleyball, and ran track growing up.
I see. So and because your parents are Dominican, right? Is it
Correct.
is it a similar sporting culture to Puerto Rico, or is that different?
Absolutely. My dad, my uncles, my mom would tell me the stories that she would sit there and when she was a little girl, there was no TV. So when her dad, she would sit there and actually create the scoreboard for her dad. So when he could come home, he knew how the baseball game unfolded. So she would sit there and write the innings, the players, the strikes, the balls, the runs, the hits, and she would do her own scoreboard for him, right? So it was incredible. So very much grew up as a baseball family. My brother got put into playing baseball very young, but like I mentioned, it wasn't really available for girls. So and everybody that saw me was like, well, put your height to use. But I'm very fortunate. My parents are so parents, right? Like their mom and dad first above all else. And so anytime I fell in love with the sport, they immersed themselves in it, right? I will never forget when I moved to the United States. I finished high school in the United States, and my mom was a college student at the time. She was getting her PhD and would come to all my basketball games with her friends. And they would be screaming in Spanish in the game. And the ref and the coach was like, who are these people, right? And my mom didn't grow up with the sport, didn't know sports that well, but because I was playing it. And my dad, even the other day, was like, Heidi, I heard about, I was watching the news and they're debating, is CONCACAF ready for the Copa America? So he's like, what does that mean? Are you guys not ready? And I'm like, no, Dad, it's just that we had some friendlies and the teams didn't do so well. So there's the narrative. Is the friendlies indicative of what's going to... So I love them for that, because if you talk to anybody, they would think my parents are the biggest football fans in the planet and all of that, but it's been through me.
They support you. That's nice.
Yes.
So, listening to your story, you have mentioned that sport hasn't always been very welcoming to you, both from the sporting side and from a business side. And you have really endured, pushed through. And I've read that you have said that you need to have a boxer mentality. So, can you explain what that is and how you have used that in your career?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it applies two ways. And I say that because I don't know sometimes what that says about me. I've told people that I see how other people deal with adversity and how I deal with adversity. And I'm sure a psychologist would have a field day with me explaining how I deal with adversity. But the reason I say that is, as a woman, at first, is every career I picked was male dominated, right? And by a significant margin. I'm not saying, everybody's saying, well, almost every career is male dominated. I'm saying a significant margin, right? Engineer, but my job was a consultant for the military. So my job was at the Pentagon, right? Where you can literally see 100 men, 2 women, right? Like it's that level of scale. And then working in sports. So there was an element of, a lot of opportunities like that were not presented to me, even though, and again, this is my personal opinion, maybe I felt like maybe I was the more qualified candidate, but you can see the decision was made more for cultural reasons, right? Through the lens, not of the organization, but of the hiring manager. I've seen some of that play out, which is tough, right? Because and that luckily that doesn't always happen, but it does happen. So that's the first thing that you have to do. And I've used this quote before, and somebody laughed because I'm like, oh my God, now it sounded like I'm the Michael Jordan. I do not mean to say I'm Michael Jordan of my role, but I love the quote that Michael Jordan said. Remember, he got cut from his high school team, right? But he said, I don't know if I'm the most talented player, but nobody's going to work harder than me, right? And I think a lot of women that work in sports bring that attitude, right? Like, I need to make sure that I work harder than everybody else to make sure that I'm giving credit for what I bring to the table, right? So that's the first thing. And the boxer mentality comes in because you will get knocked out a lot. You'll be disappointed a lot. As I mentioned, imagine going into an interview and you feel like, oh my God, like I should be top 3, and you don't even advance to that. Right, because one thing is, there's a lot of factors that can determine whether you get a job, but sometimes not to even make it to the top 5 list, right? I remember recently, a few years ago, somebody was like, I think you should apply to this role. Your name is being talked about for this role. And I had a preliminary conversation with them, and they're like, yeah, you check all the boxes. You should definitely apply to the role. And then all of a sudden, oh no, I didn't even get the interview. I'm like, that makes no sense, right? Like what? So there's so many things that come into that. So what do? Do I crawl in a little ball and be like, but everybody told me I was great. Like, I put myself out there to pursue the job, even though it wasn't something I immediately gravitated to, but like everybody's feedback, and then you don't get the interview. Like, what do you do at that point? In commercial, right? Like, people all the time in the organization, it's like, they don't understand that, if you have a 10% success rate, you're amazing, right? Like baseball, right? Like, think about baseball, that if you have a 0.34 average, you're like, you're an all-star and you're in the Hall of Fame. Sales is like that, right? Where you have to have 1,000 conversations to maybe get to put together 100 proposals to maybe get an opportunity to close 5. So how do you deal with that adversity? Because then that means that 1,000 to 100, that's 900, punches in the face. Then to get from the 100 to the 10 proposal, that's 90 more, and then punches in the face. So how do you get up from that? And that's something that I don't know why I'm wired that way. You tell me no, you close the door on me, or I get rejected, I come back more determined than ever. Like, just go, okay, that means I got to work harder. That means I missed something, so I got to study more. Like, and that's where the boxer, and why the boxer, just really quickly, is you sit there, and I don't know if you've ever had the chance, our viewers, our listeners, sorry, to ever go to a boxing match. Sometimes when you see it live, you don't appreciate it as much on TV, but when you see it live, you actually even hear the strength of that punch. And you're there going like, oh my goodness, you're going to get paid regardless, right? There's prize money for both. Take your check, stay down, right? And you're like, even us, like at the audience, like, do not take any more. And they're wired like, no, I got to get up. I want to finish the fight on my own 2 feet, right? And that's why I like that analogy. I tell every woman and everybody that works in this industry, find a way that at the end of the day, you finish the fight in your own 2 feet, even if you don't win it.
I love that. Really, really inspirational thing. And I see the headlines now. We have Heidi Pellerano, the Michael Jordan of CONCACAF. It will be.
I did. I said that in a conference, and I could see like everybody. I'm like, oh my God, no.
No, that's really funny. And adding to this, drive and determination to always get up and get better, you also have invested a lot in your knowledge. So you mentioned before that you took the master's degree in sports management after to add on, and you also have an MBA. But except for the the traditional educational path, how else are you investing in your knowledge?
Yeah, absolutely. I got to give credit where credit's due. This is something my mother in particular inspired on us. Education it was always a top priority at home. And it was great because I could not go out to play. My mom knew the best motivation. I could not go play sports until my homework was done. So I always was like, I got home, sat down to do my homework so I could go out and play. So very smart of her. But I will tell you this, I think education should never end, right? I still have, you know, I'm a chief commercial officer and people say, what do you still have to learn? So much, right? So there's when you're young, maybe easier to go to school, but there's a lot of education that you can do, just books. I read a lot of books around leadership. I read a lot of books around organizations that to see why they were successful. There's great books about others, why they failed. So I like to see both perspectives, but I also spend a lot of time reading, like, you know, trade, going to events. Like a lot of times, you know, going back to the event like I did last weekend, Mexico was so funny because most people thought, oh, you're going to come in, do your presentation and leave. And I was like, well, then I get nothing out of the conference, right? You get my time. And what did I get out of the conference? So I sat there with my team and we balanced and said, okay, I want to do one-on-one meetings with the following people. So can you cover these presentations? And then I will be able to sit at these presentations myself. So that's how we mapped it out. And we really, between the three of us, got the most out of that conference. And you could see everybody was so kind of taken back because they're like, but you're an executive, you're busy. I'm like, yes, but this is important. And I came back with a list of 10 companies that I met that could help us be more efficient, smarter at what we do. So I started working on the recap to share with the broader organization, met new people. So now expanded my network. You know, so that to me is how it's, and in my previous job, because I can't take credit for this, but one of my previous bosses, Gary Stevenson, who is now the deputy commissioner of the MLS, he used to talk about the characteristics he looked for in individuals that worked for him. And one of them was curiosity, right? And he always talked about that because that curiosity is what nurtures you want to continue to learn. And he always used to say that, like, look at the difference of somebody that reads an article and forwards it to you versus a person that reads an article, forwards it to you with a paragraph saying, oh my God, I read this. This is so interesting because it could impact us in this way. How, you know, there's a difference in that, right? It's a very subtle difference. And so that's something that I'm very grateful that it's always been innate in me. I'm extremely curious. I'm that person since I was a child. My brother was the same way. My poor parents, my brother and I would see a fan and we're like, how does it work? And we would pull it apart and my parents would be like, I hope you guys remember how to put it together. And 70% of the time, 80% of the time, we were able to put it all together. Sometimes we ended up with a couple of extra parts and we're like, but that was something that I encourage everybody to continue to do. And lastly, I would say with them, it's been proven, right? Because it's sometimes important to give statistical facts that most CEOs, right, across the organization, the reason they became CEOs is because they have the most diverse background from international experience, different departments, right? So, and that if you're not an innate person that continues to be curious and invest in yourself, you are potentially limiting your ability to be at the top of your profession, which is something that I think almost everybody aspires to.
Definitely. So I like that a lot. Since you talked about with that making the most of your time, because I think that, you know, after COVID, there are a lot of meetings. It became a culture of meetings and Teams meetings. And sometimes you've had a meeting and you think like, what did I do here? And could I have done something better with this half an hour, an hour? And as you said, like going to the conference, like, no, I don't like this setup. I want it like this and this and this, because this will give me the most. I think that's something that many people can implement also in their job to get the most out of a meeting or a conference or something similar.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, you're absolutely right. It is crazy how many meetings we have. And I'm that person that I'm like, we could have solved this in an email, right? So obviously I can't change everybody, but I can change my habits. And that's one of the things that is important for everybody also listening. A lot of times people ask me, who has been my best teachers, right? And I've kind of said, actually, my best teachers or teaching moments have been the bad ones, right? The people that are not very good, in my opinion, good leaders, because I'm able to say, okay, why didn't that work for you? How did that make you feel? Do you want another person to feel that way? Absolutely not, right? So usually, and bad leaders, it could be, personalities, but sometimes it's like maybe they're not really good communicators. So I think about, well, how did I feel? Well, I felt I was in the dark. I felt like I was doing my job with half of the information. So therefore I wasn't being able to be my best self. Okay, then you might be busy, but remember, you have team members that could feel the same way. Okay, no, then I have to find time to, even if it's like very small, like, hey, this might not be perfect, or like a voicemail, say, guys, I just came out of this meeting, this, and that, boom, right? And you can see the team immediately, oh my God, thank you so much, right? So that is something that I always like to stress with people, that there's a lot of learnings when you're surrounded by excellence, but there's also a lot of learnings surrounded by maybe things that I won't say that are not excellent and maybe are not the perfect fit for you and your personality.
100%. So on that topic, what would be your best advice for a young person with aspirations to work in sports?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing is understand why you want to work in sports. That's the first filter. A lot of time, and I felt that myself too, where I could have probably done a better job of preparing myself to answer why I wanted to work in sports. But that's the number one thing when you get into it, right? Like when you start talking to people and say why you want to work in sports, they immediately go into their fandom. But sports is a business. This is a true business for F1 and cricket and all that. Those are ginormous $1 million, $1 billion businesses. Mine, it's a business, but it's a not-for-profit, but it's still, at the end of the day, it's guided by business principles. So that is extreme. The first thing I would tell people is like, it's very easy to say you want to work in sports, but not be able to explain that in a way that really gives credit to the fact that it is a business and not something that you're doing. Because once you work in sports, sometimes depending on the role you find, you will have the least amount of time to watch sports, right? So that's something that I would say is number one. Number two, I would say, please be mindful. This is the biggest, smallest industry in the world, right? It is huge, but we are somehow all connected, like that game 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon. It works in sports as well. So be very mindful of how you present yourself in every situation, because you just never know who that person knows and how that can be connected to your dream job, right? So that to me is always the second advice, is to keep that in mind. And then the third, the piece of advice is, as I mentioned, continue to invest in yourself, right? The world is changing, technology is changing, fan behavior is changing, the sports that are becoming more relevant are changing, right? There's a lot of growth expected in rugby and cricket. So be open-minded, right? I think that was the one thing that I think a lot of times people come in and say, no, I want to work in football. Well, maybe there's not an opportunity in football right now that makes sense. Why don't you work in rugby and leverage that experience to come in and later to work in your dream job? But everybody wants their dream job day one, and they lose sight that it's a journey.
That's fantastic. 3 great and actionable advice. So closing in on an hour here, I like to finish these chats with a networking question. So who from your network do you think would be a good guest on this podcast?
Oh, I have so many. I will say, I'm going to go a little bit, get a little bit off the cuff, because I think it's important to have more people see diversity, right? Because obviously a lot of times when you bring people that are from the US, people are like, oh, you guys are in a completely different level because of what you're achieving. But I would say, I'm going to give you 2 names. One is Karina LeBlanc, and I'm going to explain why. Karina LeBlanc used to be our head of women's football and now is the general manager of the Portland Thorns. International for Canada for many years, played 5 World Cups, won Olympic medals. But I'm bringing her because I think she's a perfect example and inspiration for players that want to transition into the administration of sport, right? So I would say her, because also she and I connected from the get-go, because she recognized a lot of the things that I mentioned. The minute I walked in, she's like, I can learn from you, so you're going to have to deal with it. I'm going to sit down in your office and extract as much info as I can from you every second I can. And I was like, okay, right? Man, your wish is my command. So I would say that. And then another person, because I'm so proud of her, and these are like little sisters for me, but another one is Mariana Gutierrez. She's the director of the Liga MX Femenil. And what she's doing in the culture in which she's doing it and how she's going at it every single day to grow that league and the upside in that league and what you see already happening with some of the clubs and some of the moves that they're making now to become like be more independent from the men's league and putting like I admire her a lot, and she did all of that while getting her master's degree, and I was like, how, right? And obviously just seeing her last week presenting, like I sat back, like I'm like, man, I'm having a big sister moment. Like I'm really proud of what she's doing and what she represents for the sport, and I think her upside is limitless for both of them, actually.
Fantastic. And I think it's important for the listeners to understand this, how important the networking is. This is how we got in contact. I asked on the previous episode, who do you think? They recommended you, and here we are. So, I mean, you mentioned going to conferences and so forth. So really encouraging the listeners to do that if they want to, work in this industry, networking, talk to people. It's really important.
And you know, believe it or not, I know some people don't believe this, but I am very much an introvert. But I commit to not be an introvert in these settings because so I think it's important to get out of your comfort zone, and you see people, and then if everybody's kind of saying, oh, I don't know that person, who's going to make the first move, don't waste a minute, right? Every chance you get, make the most out of it.
Yeah, perfect. Great way to end this episode. Heidi Pellerano, thank you so much for taking the time to be on Sports Management Podcast.
Thank you so much, Marcus. It was a pleasure, and I hope everybody listening got something out of this. And obviously, feel free, anybody, to reach out on LinkedIn if I can be of any assistance in your careers.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Awesome.